Njal'sSaga is an Icelandic saga written in about the 13th century that describes events that took place approximately between 960 and 1020. It is most likely at least partially historical, with the writer, who is unknown, having taken at least some artistic license at some points. Some of those points are more obvious than others. The story describes a blood feud between families, or several blood feuds, depending on how you look at it, that takes place over several generations. If I had had more time to read it, something that I would have liked to have done would have been to go very carefully and try to figure out everything that each character did, because there are two challenges in this story. One is that there are a lot of characters, but two is that the names are Icelandic names, and they have a very nice sound, but if you don't speak a Scandinavian language, or Icelandic specifically, they can be hard to remember, or at least they were for me. But there are certainly primary and secondary characters. Some of the primary characters are, of course, Njal and his friend Gunnar. These are probably the two main characters, and we will look at some descriptions of them, but briefly, Njal is a lawyer and a sage, whereas Gunnar is a very tough warrior. And there are many other characters, many of them appearing throughout the story. One significant one is Halgarda, who is the wife of Gunnar, and she is a bit of a troublemaker, as we'll see. As I said, the story is probably at least partially historical, with some fiction mixed in there, though scholars have all kinds of different opinions about this. Some say that it's totally historical, some say that it's completely fiction, and then every combination of one to the other that you can imagine. There are scholars who think that that is what is the case with Njal'sSaga. One thing that can be considered certain is that Njal and Gunnar were both real historical people, and their deaths are also noted in other sources. So this makes Njal'sSaga, if only on that point, a bit like the Song of Roland, which we looked at on this podcast, which took a real historical event and expanded on it poetically. In other ways, Njal'sSaga is very different from the Song of Roland. One thing that was interesting about reading this text was that when I started reading it, I felt an unusual level of blindness about it. I had heard of it sometime in the last few years, and I made a note of it to check it out, but I knew almost nothing about it. And another thing that I do when I read these books is afterwards, not always, but I sometimes go and look at what scholars had to say about it, especially if it's a text that I felt like I had some difficulty with. And while I'm sure there is plenty of scholarship about this saga, it's not readily available on the internet. Some books, when you look them up, there's just endless pages of people talking about them. And this one wasn't really like that. And what little I did find sometimes left out what I think are very significant parts of the story. So there isn't, as far as I could see, a mainstream established interpretation and explanation of this text. There are people here and there working on it. I'm sure that in Icelandic, this is some kind of national epic and people have gone over it very carefully. But in English, there was a lot less. And in this project that I'm doing of reading through the European literary canon, or as much of it as I can, there's a challenge, which is that a lot of the books that are generally considered canon are among the most read books ever. But a secondary thing that I'm doing is trying to find books that perhaps are not typically considered part of the canon, but they should be. And also maybe to jettison some books that generally are, though I'd be more cautious about doing the latter. I'd be more likely to tell somebody if they asked me, well, you can skip that one for now, I'd start over here first. But since we don't know who wrote Njal'sSaga, or exactly when they wrote it or where, it's hard to talk too much about the historical context. So we can start by looking generally at some of the elements of the story. The story is both complex and straightforward. And by that I mean there's a lot going on, there are a lot of characters, there's a lot of different relationships between them. But the description in the story, the actual writing of the story, is almost entirely either action or speech. There are a few bits of description of people's clothing. There's almost no description of nature. I can think of one example of a description of nature. But pretty much the entire story is this person went here, he said this, they stabbed each other, this guy went over here, they got together to try to settle this matter, they went to the thing. We'll get to the thing. This is an interesting thing I learned in reading this, is that the thing, just like the modern English word thing, was a kind of annual assembly in at least Iceland, and they would get together and share news and settle problems and maybe do some business. And this eventually led to the creation of the Althing, which was the first Icelandic parliament. The story also mentions the Gula thing, which appears to have been a comparable tribal council in Norway. And then there was the Skala thing, which I'm still not able to identify specifically, but it was some kind of council or assembly. Another thing about the story is that there are characters coming in without warning, like in real life. It's not a very neat story where there's a cast of characters at the beginning and they bounce off each other for a while, and then the story ends. You're going along, and then suddenly this other person now affects the drama a lot, and they haven't been mentioned up to now, and that's how human life actually is. That's how life in a family actually is that the family's going along, and then some other person that maybe they've never met before suddenly can have a big impact on their lives. Everything is going along fine until some new dummies come into the picture and upset everything. And there are also passages that are not exactly relevant to the narrative. They'll talk, for example, about this character who up to now has played a big part in the drama. Now they moved away to another country and they spent the rest of their days somewhere else, and they're no longer in the story. And the fact that the writer went to the trouble of adding that detail, talking about what happened to this person, even though it doesn't further the action of the story, may indicate that some of that is factual, or at least based on oral tradition, rather than being purely poetical. Because as poetry, sometimes it's not terribly gripping. It never goes on for very long, but there will be a few sentences talking about this guy going somewhere, which, if you're trying to do it for artistic effect, it doesn't make too much sense. But if you're trying to do it as a record of what happened to this person, it makes perfect sense. And when we're looking at this story and trying to figure out exactly what it is, how should we look at this? How should we think about it? One thing to consider is that while it's tempting to look at a story like this, something from 13th century Iceland, about which, unless you specialize in that period and that area, we in America don't tend to think about this time and place very much. So we don't know much about it, though we should, because it seems like a very interesting time and place. Since we don't know much about it, it is tempting to say, oh, this must have been what that time and place was like. There were these families, these guys were stabbing each other all the time. The lives described in Njal'sSaga must have been typical of medieval Iceland, 10th century Iceland, 13th century Iceland. And while we can conjecture about certain aspects of the culture of that time based on this text, we can just as easily say that somebody went to the trouble of writing all of this down because it was exceptional in some way. It wouldn't have been typical in the 13th century to write a novel, as they started to do in the 19th and the 20th and 21st centuries, about ordinary life, about the poetry and beauty of living a simple life and the dramas that can still emerge therefrom. That wasn't something typical of medieval literature. It was much more typical to go to the trouble of writing, which was very expensive. It required educated people, paper, ink, all very expensive equipment. You needed to have a better reason to be doing that. And so it's more likely that Njal'sSaga is describing something that was perhaps not an anomaly at that time, but at least exceptional in its scope and the total number of gallons of blood that were spilled over it. But to talk about some of the broad ideas in the story, I think it's a story about family, about friendship, about peace, about shifting alliances. There are a lot of marriages in the story that are significant. The marriages are interesting. They generally involve bargaining over the dowry or the terms of the marriage, but also it's notable that the women get the final say in the marriage. From what I could tell, often it happens that you go and talk to the girl's father first, and then if he's okay with it, then you go and talk to her, and if she thinks it's a good idea, then you get married. But she still has the option of vetoing it, of saying no. But honor is also a very big part of the story. This combination of lawsuits and bloodletting takes up much of the story, being alternatively in what we would today call a court or on the battlefield, or at least fighting with somebody physically in the open air. It's not often a full battle with two armies facing off. It's more often two guys or a small group of guys fighting. But they're continually trying to settle matters peacefully trying to come to an agreement. Sometimes those efforts succeed, at least for a while. Sometimes they don't succeed at all. There are a lot of prophetic dreams. A lot of characters have dreams where they see something and that foretells what's going to happen. And there's also a lot of poetry and songs. And that's something that's maybe a little different from how we would tell a story today. We don't usually have poetry sitting in the middle of a novel. But what's interesting is we do have the combination of music and narrative in other forms. The example that might most readily come to most people's minds is Disney movies. And I haven't seen too many Disney movies recently, but when I was a kid, Disney movies definitely had a lot of music and singing in them. And the action would be going along, and then there'd be a song, and then the action would keep going. And of course, the older and more sophisticated version of this is opera. And neither of these are quite like the way that Njal'sSaga uses poetry. Poetry makes up probably less than 1% of the text. But it's unusual that it's there at all. And what's even more interesting about it is that, from what I understand about this period, this was not an artistic device that would have only been something that the author of Njal'sSaga did, that he wrote things to show his skill in writing poetry. That might have been part of it, certainly. But from what little I know about Old Norse poetry, I went down this rabbit hole sometime in the last 6 months. There are basically two broad categories, skaldic and Eddic, and skaldic is more structured, Eddic is a little more loose. But more importantly, different kinds of this poetry would have been written extempore. It would have been written spontaneously from somebody's mind. They would have just improvised it on a certain occasion. And there are two notable examples in Njal'sSaga, though these are not the only ones. In one of them, a guy cuts off another guy's head and then recites a little poem about it. And in another one, a guy gets really mad at something. Kari, one of the main characters, gets really mad about something, and he's running across the room reciting this poem, and then he chops off the guy's head as he gets to him. So I don't know how realistic the second of those two would have been. If you were about to kill somebody, would you also be trying to show off with poetry? Though maybe that would have made it an even more intimidating display of one's prowess. I know if somebody were coming to kill me, I would be even more thrown if they were reciting poetry while they did it. And I've long believed that if you lived in the time before technology, the time before what we call the entertainment industry, then you had a lot more time to, never mind learn how to fight or learn how to farm or learn these other skills. You had a lot more time where you were sitting around and talking with your friends. And so to be able to do wordplay, to be able to speak well, was not only something that was more useful, because it would have been entertaining to the people around you. You spent more time talking, I imagine, and so you might have gotten better at it without trying, though there's certainly no connection between the amount of time that somebody talks and how good they are at talking. There are plenty of people who talk a lot and aren't very good at it. Another way that they often settle disputes is by single combat. Two people can agree to face off, and whoever wins, probably one person's going to die, but if they don't die, if they just lose, then the other person gets what they want. And alternatively, a person can challenge somebody to single combat, and if the other person refuses, then the first person gets what they want immediately. And from what I can tell, this would have been in accordance with Icelandic law at the time. And that's worth emphasizing. When people think of the Middle Ages, or specifically of this kind of environment, they might think of the word anarchy or the word lawlessness. But this environment was far from lawless. It might have been proto-legal. They could relatively easily kill each other without any kind of state coming in to punish them. It might have been anarchic in that sense. There wasn't an obvious state, but there were factions who were trying to maintain peace and trying not to let a conflict get out of hand to the detriment of everybody. So this tension between law and violence, resolving something by legal means and resolving it by violent means, would make Njal'sSaga, at least excerpts from it, good reading side by side with the Leviathan of Thomas Hobbes, who's always talking about what happens in the absence of a state. Because though Njal'sSaga is not a political science text, of course, it being something close to a documentary account, and this is the part where the scholarship of how historical this story is would be useful, it being an account of an area without a state that was trying to keep itself balanced, that all the people there had a mutual interest in not letting anything become too violent, but then they had their individual interests about their honor and whatever else. This is an unusual document if it is historical, because it shows us with some detail how this kind of conflict played out. And that was part of why I would have liked to have been able to look more closely at it, not just the broad strokes of the conflict, but all the different people involved, all the different court cases would require a second read and some careful, intentional note-taking to that specific end to sort out. They celebrate Yule, and Christianity becomes a component in the story toward the end of it, and the tension between an incoming Christianity and the Norse pagan religion. Another note that I have about the violence is that the characters, at least twice, and maybe more than that, after they kill somebody, they say, "I give notice of this slaying as done by my hand," which that's pretty much the opposite of what anybody who would kill anybody today would do. You wouldn't give notice that you're the one who did it. This is an action that only makes any sense at all in a context where killing is a way to settle the balance of honor. If you are going to kill somebody because they've dishonored you in some way, and in order to maintain your status, you have to kill them to show that you're stronger than them, it's not useful to you if they were killed by some brigand on the road. That doesn't settle your honor. It only settles your honor if you're the one who did it. So in that case, not only is it acceptable if people know that you're the one who did the killing, it's preferable. In fact, it's the only acceptable outcome. People have to know, otherwise it's pointless. The point is that you're the one who went and killed the guy because he insulted you somehow. Or in one case, beat your daughter so badly that she bled. And that brings us maybe to the most important element in the story, it being the driving force of a lot of the action, which is revenge. And it's not a cartoonish Hollywood depiction of revenge, where somebody is seething mad and they work themselves into a rage and they go and kill somebody. It's apparently often a cold, calm, direct revenge that's just matter of fact. He did this, so I have to go do that. And that doesn't make it better, but if we're trying to study and understand how the people in such an environment were likely to think and act, it's worth noting that the author of Njal'sSaga never emphasizes how mad somebody was. That apparently wasn't a significant component in this very complex social environment. And I'm not going to try to summarize the whole story, but we can look at some of the events and the characters. As I mentioned, there's Gunnar's wife, Halgarda, who, before she gets married to Gunnar, she has two previous husbands, both of whom her father kills as a result of her manipulations. And Gunnar is warned about this before he marries her, but he marries her anyway. And then she gets into a fight with Njal's wife, because Njal and Gunnar are friends. And these two women being in a fight, they arrange the killings of members of each other's households. So now Gunnar and Njal's families are fighting, even though they're good friends. But now we can get into some passages from Njal'sSaga. First, to show this contrast that I'm talking about between the surprising legal system in medieval Iceland, late 10th, early 11th century Iceland. The contrast between all the different forms of arbitration and efforts to settle things and the ways that they can try to achieve peace without violence, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the bloody violence that's in the story. And so I want to read two passages and just note the difference between these two passages. This first one is describing a court system. Quote, "These matters shall come before it," says Njal, "all matters of contempt of the thing, such as if men bear false witness, or utter a false finding. Hitherto shall come all those suits in which the judges are divided in opinion in the quarter court. Then they shall be summoned to the fifth court. So too, if men offer bribes, or take them, for their help in suits. In this court all the oaths shall be of the strongest kind, and 2 men shall follow every oath, who shall support on their words of honor what the others swear. So it shall be also, if the pleadings on one side are right in form, and the other wrong, that the judgment shall be given for those that are right in form. Every suit in this court shall be pleaded just as is now done in the quarter court, save and except that when 4 12s are named in the fifth court. Then the plaintiff shall name and set aside 6 men out of the court, and the defendant other 6. But if he will not set them aside, then the plaintiff shall name them and set them aside as he has done with his own 6. But if the plaintiff does not set them aside, then the suit comes to naught. For 3 12s shall utter judgment on all suits. We shall also have this arrangement in the court of laws, that those only shall have the right to make or change laws who sit on the middle bench, and to this bench those only shall be chosen who are wisest and best. There too shall the fifth court sit. But if those who sit in the court of laws are not agreed as to what they shall allow or bring in as law, then they shall clear the court for a division, and the majority shall bind the rest. But if any man who has a seat in the court outside the court of laws and cannot get inside it, or thinks himself overborne in the suit, then he shall forbid them by a protest, so that they can hear it in the court, and then he has made all their grants and all their decisions void, and of none effect, and stopped them by his protest. So that's a passage where Njal is describing a system of courts. Now contrast that with this. Quote, Scarpitting takes a spring into the air and leaps over the stream between the ice banks, and does not check his course, but rushes still onwards with a slide. The sheet of ice was very slippery, and so he went as fast as a bird flies. Thrain was just about to put his helm on his head, and now Scarpitting bore down on them, and hews at Thrain with his axe, the ogress of war, and smote him on the head, and clove him down to the teeth, so that his jaw teeth fell out on the ice. This feat was done with such a quick sleight that no one could get a blow at him. He glided away from them at once at full speed. End quote. So these two passages together characterize a lot of what's going on in Njal'sSaga. Arbitration on one side, bloodletting on the other. These next few passages that I'm going to read are descriptions of characters. The first few are some of the main characters, but then after that, some of them are secondary characters, but I thought the descriptions were interesting. The first one is a description of Gunnar when he's first mentioned. Quote, he was a tall man in growth and a strong man, best skilled in arms of all men. He could cut or thrust or shoot if he chose as well with his left as with his right hand. And he smote so swiftly with his sword that three seemed to flash through the air at once. He was the best shot with the bow of all men and never missed his mark. He could leap more than his own height with all his war gear and as far backwards as forwards. He could swim like a seal, and there was no game in which it was any good for anyone to strive with him, and so it has been said that no man was his match. He was handsome of feature and fair-skinned. His nose was straight and a little turned up at the end. He was blue-eyed and bright-eyed and ruddy-cheeked, his hair thick and of good hue, and hanging down in comely curls. The most courteous of men was he, of sturdy frame and strong will, bountiful and gentle, a fast friend but hard to please when making them. He was wealthy in goods. End quote. So that's Gunnar. And then Njal is described thus. Quote, Njal was wealthy in goods and handsome of face. No beard grew on his chin. He was so great a lawyer that his match was not to be found. Wise too he was, and foreknowing and foresighted, of good counsel and ready to give it, and all that he advised men was sure to be the best for them to do. Gentle and generous, he unraveled every man's knotty points who came to see him about them. End quote. And you notice this contrast between these two friends. One of them is a great warrior, one of them is more of a sage, and these two somehow exemplify different aspects of some kind of ideal. And while today a lawyer has kind of a bad connotation, we mostly don't think of lawyers as being very heroic, it's interesting that the titular character in this story is Njal, is this lawyer who, among all these guys who are always killing each other over their honor and these different things, Njal has no beard on his chin. And some of the other characters in the story make fun of him for this, that he looks like a woman or something because he doesn't have a beard. The implication being, I think, not that he shaves his beard, but that he can't grow one. And while Gunnar looks more heroic, in a certain way, in a classical way, as a very capable warrior, in this kind of environment, if heroism is, among many other things, keeping the people that you care about safe, a lawyer in this environment, somebody who is able to solve a dispute, might be just as likely to keep people safe as a very capable warrior like Gunnar. This is another thing that I would love to go back and look at again to try to see if the author favored one of these two men over the other in some way. I viewed them as kind of equal in the story, and that's how it came across, but maybe I missed something. This might be something that you could look into if you go and read this. Did the author treat Gunnar and Njal differently? Did he seem to favor one of them over the other? That's one of the questions that I would like to answer if I were to read this story again. There's a character named Hogni. He's sort of a secondary character, but he is described, quote, Hogni was a brave man of few words, distrustful and slow to believe, but truthful, end quote. So Hogni was a skeptic, distrustful and slow to believe. And then there's Snorri, another secondary character, quote, Snorri was the wisest and shrewdest of all these men in Iceland who had not the gift of foresight. He was good to his friends, but grim to his foes, end quote. That's not a bad way to be, good to your friends, grim to your foes. Then there's a description of Thorgir, quote, now we must tell of Thorgir, Otkell's son. He grew up to be a tall, strong man, true-hearted and guileless, but rather too ready to listen to fair words. He had many friends among the best men, and was much beloved by his kinsmen, end quote. He was rather too ready to listen to fair words. That's a good way not to be. Don't be too ready to listen to fair words. And here's a description of Scarpitting, and this description includes the words kirtle, which is a tunic, and breeks, which is an old word for breeches or pants. Quote, he was so clad he had on a blue kirtle and gray breeks, and black shoes on his feet. Coming high up his leg, he had a silver belt about him, and that same axe in his hand with which he slew Thrain, and which he called the Ogress of War, a round buckler and a silken band round his brow, and his hair was brushed back behind his ears. He was the most soldier-like of men, and by that all men knew him. He went in his appointed place, neither before nor behind, end quote. And that sounds very similar to a line in Lord of the Rings, and Tolkien would have almost certainly read Njal'sSaga. He went in his appointed place, neither before nor behind. That's a good way to try to be in life also. The author writes, quote, Gunnar rode home and gave Njal good gifts, and thanked him for the care he had taken of his goods. Kolskegg urged him on much to ride to the Thing, saying, there thy honor will grow, for many will flock to see thee there. That has been little to my mind, says Gunnar, to make a show of myself. But I think it good and right to meet good and worthy men, end quote. So Gunnar doesn't want to go to the Thing, and remember, the Thing is a big assembly. He doesn't want to go there to show off, but he wants to go there to meet good and worthy men. And to show this scene where Gunnar's wife and Njal's wife, Gunnar's wife is Halgarda, and Njal's wife is Bergthora. And I'm sure I'm disfiguring these beautiful Icelandic names. The author writes, quote, then Halgarda took hold of Bergthora's hand and said, there's not much to choose, though, between you two. Thou hast hangnails on every finger, and Njal is beardless. That's true, says Bergthora, yet neither of us finds fault with the other for it. But Thorwald, thy husband, was not beardless, and yet you plotted his death. Then Halgarda said, it stands me in a little stead to have the bravest man in Iceland, if you do not avenge this, Gunnar. He sprang up and strode across the way from the board and said, home I will go, and it were more seemly that you should wrangle with those of your own household, and not under other men's roofs. But as for Njal, I am his debtor for much honor, and never will I be egged on by you like a fool. After that they set off home. Mind this, Bergthora, said Halgarda, that we shall meet again, end quote. So the two women get in a fight, and Gunnar's wife says, you're the strongest guy in Iceland, you better avenge me for this. And Gunnar says, it's bad enough that you would make problems in your own house, but now you're not only doing it in somebody else's house, you're doing it in Njal's house, and Njal is a great guy and I owe him so much, so let's get out of here. And then they leave, but Gunnar's wife tells Njal's wife that this isn't over, and it certainly wasn't. And to give an example of one of the prophetic dreams, or in this case it's a vision that shows up in the story, and in this passage the word fey, F-E-Y, means damned or doomed. A character, Thord, says, quote, well, this is a wondrous thing. What is it that thou seest that seems after a wondrous fashion? Says Njal. Methinks the goat lies here in the hollow, and he is all one gore of blood. Njal said that there was no goat there, nor anything else. What is it then? Says Thord. Thou must be a fey man, says Njal, and thou must have seen the fetch that follows thee, and now beware of thyself. That will stand me in no stead, says Thord, if death is doomed for me, end quote. So this guy sees a goat, but it's all slaughtered, its gore is everywhere, its blood and guts are everywhere. And Njal says, there's no goat, you're seeing things. And the guy says, well, what's it mean? And he says, you must be doomed or damned, so you should be careful. And Thord says, well, if I'm doomed, then there's nothing to be done about it. In another scene, some guys have attacked a member of Njal's family. The author writes, after they fell on him, he broke a spear of each of them, so well did he guard himself. Then Skjold cut off his hand, and he still kept them off with his other hand for some time, till Sigmund thrust him through. Then he fell dead to earth. They threw over him turf and stones, and Thrain said, we have won an ill work, and Njal's sons will take this slaying ill when they hear of it, end quote. So the guy fights them off for long enough to break each of their spears, and then they cut off his hand while they're fighting, but he keeps fighting for a while, and eventually they kill him. And Thrain says, this is going to be a problem. Njal's sons are going to come at us after this. And it's not only the men in the story who are concerned with their honor as men. Halgarda, again, Gunnar's wife, says on 2 different occasions, once she says, quote, there's not a pin to choose between you, for both of you are so blate, end quote. And blate means soft. There is not a pin to choose between you is a saying, and we might say neither is better than the other. But she derides the 2 men that she's talking to as being soft. And later she says, what were Njal's sons doing? They think themselves men at any rate, end quote. And Halgarda is, as I mentioned, one of the prime troublemakers in the story. So she's not necessarily somebody who any woman should emulate. But she is also both concerned about and measuring the strength of the men around her. And I would argue that modern women, whether they acknowledge it or not, do that also, though they might not be as open about it as Halgarda is. Here's a passage. Quote, Scarpitting saw Halgarda's shepherd, just as he had hewn off Sigmund's head. He handed the head to the shepherd, and bade him bear it to Halgarda, and said she would know whether that head had made jeering songs about them. And with that, he sang a song. Here, this head shall thou that heapest hordes from ocean caverns won, bear to Halgard with my greeting, her that hurries men to fight. Sure am I, O firewood splitter, that yon spendthrift knows it well and will answer if it ever uttered mocking songs on us. And Sigmund, this guy whose head Scarpitting cut off and had sent to Halgarda, had a kind of ambiguous relationship with Halgarda. There's another passage that reads, quote, Halgarda was good to Sigmund, and it soon came about that things grew so warm that she loaded him with money, and tended him no worse than her husband, and many talked about that, and did not know what lay under it, end quote. So the implication there was that Sigmund was Halgarda's lover, and that also explains why Scarpitting called Halgarda that yon spendthrift. A spendthrift is somebody who spends a lot of money. At one point, Gunnar says, I will have no hand in any robbery. And that's interesting because he's killing people all throughout this story. So he views killing and stealing as being very different, or maybe killing under certain circumstances as very different from robbery, which is just a petty crime, I guess. But then later he says, quote, I would like to know whether I am by so much less the brisk and bold than other men because I think more of killing men than they, end quote. So that's showing he has some hesitation about killing men. He doesn't like to do it, and asks whether that makes him less brisk and bold than other men. At one point, Gunnar asks Njal for some advice, and that goes as follows, quote, But give me some cunning counsel, says Gunnar. I will do that, says Njal. Never slay more than 1 man in the same stock, and never break the peace which good men and true make between thee and others, and least of all in such a matter as this. Gunnar said, I should have thought there was more risk of that with others than with me. Like enough, says Njal, but still thou shalt so think of thy quarrels that if that should come to pass of which I have warned thee, then thou wilt have but a little while to live. But otherwise, thou wilt come to be an old man. Gunnar said, Dost thou know what will be thine own death? I know it, says Njal. What? asked Gunnar. That, says Njal, which all would be the last to think. After that, Gunnar rode home. End quote. So Gunnar asks Njal for some good advice, and Njal says, don't kill 2 people from the same family, and don't break a peace that you've settled. And Gunnar says, well, I'd be more worried about somebody else doing that. And Njal says, well, you'd probably be right to do so, but if you ever do either of those 2 things, your death will be soon after. And this turns out to be true in the story, and we might get into exactly how, but for now we can just talk about how Njal is not only a sage, he's not only a good lawyer or a good judge, somebody who's wise and makes good decisions, but he's also a bit of a prophet. He's so wise that he can see the future a little bit, or a lot, apparently, if he can see his own death. And there's a line which is a part of a dialogue where they're talking about something else, but I think it expresses a bigger part of the story. The author writes, quote, With law shall our land be built up and settled, and with lawlessness wasted and spoiled, end quote. So that's saying flat out this tension between law and anarchy, law and lawlessness. And all of the individual participants, as we said, have an interest in maintaining the law long term, though some of them have an interest in violating it short term. But if the whole law falls apart, then that'll be bad for everybody. This next passage is another example of these prophetic visions, or not even necessarily a vision that one person has, but a prophetic omen, something that appears and it signals something that's going to happen. And the passage also uses the term halberd, which is a weapon that's basically an axe with a long handle and a spike on the top. The author writes, quote, "That token happened as Gunnar and his brother rode up toward Rang River, that much blood burst out on the halberd. Kolskegg asked what that might mean. Gunnar said, if such tokens took place in other lands, it was called wound drops, and Master Oliver told me also that this only happened before great fights." End quote. So as they're riding along, a lot of blood suddenly, spontaneously pours out of their halberd, and this is an omen of a big fight to come. And it's apparently a common enough occurrence that it has a name. They call it wound drops. In another part of the story, they've made an agreement such that Gunnar and Kolskegg are going to leave Iceland for 3 years. They made the agreement with another party. But then Gunnar sees the natural beauty of his homeland and decides he doesn't want to go, so he doesn't. Quote, "Gunnar threw his arms round each of the household when he was ready to go, and every one of them went out of doors with him. He leaned on the butt of his spear and leapt into the saddle, and he and Kolskegg rode away. They rode down along Markfleet, and just then Gunnar's horse tripped and threw him off. He turned with his face up toward the Lythe and the homestead at Lithend, and said, 'Fair is the Lythe, so fair that it has never seemed to me so fair. The cornfields are white to harvest, and the home mead is mown. And now I will ride back home, and not fare abroad at all. Do not this joy to thy foes,' said Kolskegg, 'by breaking thy atonement, for no man could think thou would do this. And thou mayst be sure that all will happen as Njal has said. I will not go away anywhere,' says Gunnar, 'and so I would thou shouldst do too.' 'That shall not be,' said Kolskegg. 'I will never do a base thing in this, nor in anything else which is left to my good faith. And this is that one thing that could tear us asunder. But tell this to my kinsmen and to my mother, that I never mean to see Iceland again, for I shall soon learn that thou art dead, brother, and there will be nothing left to bring me back.' So they parted there and then. Gunnar rode home to Lithend, but Kolskegg rode to the ship and went abroad." And there's at least two things going on here. One is that this is the fulfillment of Njal's prediction of his prophecy. He advised Gunnar to be careful not to break any peace that he had made, and then Gunnar does exactly that. And this also then leads to, as we will see, Gunnar's death. And again, rather than spoil the story, to know some of the main points of the narrative before you sit down to try to read it, I think would enhance the reading. It would make it better, not worse. Because there are many other intricate details of this story besides the broad strokes that I'm describing here. But then the second thing is that Gunnar, this otherwise noble and capable man, breaks an agreement and dies as a result. And on the one hand, such a bloody environment like this, where a blood feud is able to go on for a long time, we might look at it and think of it as kind of lawless, that of course you could break an agreement and you might do a bunch of other things too. But you'll remember that Gunnar said he wouldn't have anything to do with any kind of robbery, and here, him breaking this agreement results in his death. This is a little bit of a speculation, but there might be something of a moral lesson in that for Middle Ages Icelandic readers. That if you were reading this a long time ago, you might notice that and go, see, that's why you should never break an agreement, because even Gunnar, even this very powerful warrior, died as a result of breaking his agreement. And this is also an environment where people's word matters a lot. When they're going through these arbitrations and they're negotiating, somebody says, well, what do you want? And the other says, well, I want this or whatever. At least once, and I think more than once, it comes up that what the other side wants is a vow. They want the person to swear something. I swear that such and such, or I promise that such and such. And that sounds a little bit quaint to the modern legal system, that if somebody vows something, that's very valuable. Except that if you live in this environment and word gets out that you broke a promise, that you broke a vow, and that you're somebody who, when you vow something, that doesn't mean anything to you, that's going to hurt your status a lot, and not just in this simple way that people will look at you askance as a liar. It'll hurt your ability to get things done. You're very much dependent on your own ability, especially as a man, as the head of your household, your ability to negotiate with somebody when you're trying to buy something, and your trustworthiness is a significant component of that. And if you're viewed as untrustworthy, it might be hard for you to buy stuff, certainly to borrow money, So to have somebody vow something is very significant. Anyway, it might not be overreading too much to think that there's a little bit of a moral lesson in the death of Gunnar, not only for people living in the Middle Ages, but for today also. Keep your word. So anyway, Gunnar does not leave Iceland, and he goes on as if nothing is different, and eventually the other side figures out that he's still there, and so they go and find him and attack him. And the fight goes on for a long time, but here are some passages from that. And you'll notice here another cultural component that is going to come up again later in the story, but I think the author was deliberately emphasizing it here to set it up for later. Quote, "Let us burn him house and all," said Mord. "That shall never be," said Gizur, "though I knew that my life lay on it. But it is easy for thee to find out some plan, such a cunning man as thou art said to be. Some ropes lay there on the ground, and they were often used to strengthen the roof." Then Mord said, "Let us take the ropes and throw one end over end of the carrying beams, but let us fasten the other end to these rocks and twist them tight with levers, and so pull the roof off the hall." So they took the ropes, and all lent a hand to carry this out, and before Gunnar was aware of it, they had pulled the whole roof off the hall. Then Gunnar still shot with his bow so that they could never come near him. Then Mord said again that they must burn the house over Gunnar's head. But Gizur said, "I do not know why you speak of that which no one else wishes, and that shall never be." Just then, Thorbrand, Thorlik's son, sprang up on the roof and cut asunder Gunnar's bowstring. Gunnar clutched the halberd with both hands and turned it on him quickly and drove it through him and hurled him down on the ground. Then up sprang Asprand, his brother. Gunnar thrust at him with the halberd, and he threw his shield before the blow, but the halberd passed clean through the shield and broke both his arms, and down he fell from the wall. Gunnar had already wounded 8 men and slain those 2. By that time Gunnar had gotten 2 wounds, and all men said that he never once winced either at wounds or death. End quote. So we're going to pause there. So they come upon where Gunnar is living, and one guy says, "Let's burn down the house." And the leader says, "No way, we're not doing that." And then they use ropes and rocks to pull the roof off the house. And in the meantime, Gunnar is shooting so many arrows at them that they can't even get close. And so one guy somehow sneaks up and cuts his bowstring, and Gunnar kills him, but still having his bowstring cut is a big problem. But one guy died just to take out Gunnar's bowstring. And then, in a passage here that I'm just going to paraphrase, he asks his wife, Halgarda, you'll remember this woman who was starting all these problems, to pluck out a couple pieces of her own hair and to tie up a bowstring for him to replace his cut bowstring while he's fighting them, because he slapped her at one point in the past. She says, "Now I will call to your mind that slap on the face which you gave me, and I care not a whit whether you hold out a long while or short." So she completely leaves him in the lurch. And obviously, you shouldn't hit women, and he shouldn't have hit her. But it's hard not to see in this situation a big exaggeration of a way that, in my experience, women can sometimes remember something that hurt their feelings at really the wrong moment. There's several dozen guys surrounding the house to kill Gunnar, and he's about to die, and he says, "Look, make a bowstring for me, I need to fight these guys off." And she says, "No, because of that one time that whatever." And then he dies because of it, basically. And again, that's not to belittle him hitting her, but if we're going to take an accounting of that, we should also take an accounting of her doing this now leads to his death. She didn't kill him. He, first of all, should have left Iceland to begin with, and even after that, it's not her, it's these guys who have come to kill him who are going to kill him, so it's not her fault. But this refusal of hers is the last link in the chain that leads to his death. Now, picking up from the same spot, quote, "Gunnar made a stout and bold defense, and now wounded 8 other men with such sore wounds that many lay at death's door. Gunnar kept them all off until he felt worn out with toil. Then they wounded him with many and great wounds, but still he got away out of their hands, and held his own against them a while longer. But at last it came about that they slew him." Of this defense of his, Thorkel, the skald of Göta-Elf, sang in the verses which follow, "We have heard how south in Iceland Gunnar guarded well himself, boldly battles thunder wielding, fiercest iceman on the wave. Hero of the golden collar, 16 with the sword he wounded in the shock that Odin loveth, 2 before him tasted death." But this is what Thormod Olafsson sang. "None that scattered sea's bright sunbeams won more glorious fame than Gunnar. So runs fame of old in Iceland, fitting fame of heathen men. Lord of fight when helms were crashing, lives of foemen twain he took, wielding bitter steel he sorely wounded 12 and 4 besides. Then Gizur spoke and said, We have now laid low to earth a mighty chief, and hard work has it been, and the fame of this defense of his shall last as long as men live in this land. End quote. So that's the death of Gunnar. And then later on, something interesting happens by his grave. And this passage uses the term cairn, C-A-I-R-N, which is a type of grave marker that Norse people used, and it's just a stack of rough stones. So you just pile up rocks in an orderly and relatively vertical way to mark the spot where the person is buried. The author writes, quote, Now those two, Scarpitting and Hogni, were out of doors one evening by Gunnar's cairn on the south side. The moon and stars were shining clear and bright, but every now and then the clouds drove over them. Then all at once they thought they saw the cairn standing open, and lo, Gunnar had turned himself in the cairn and looked at the moon. They thought they saw 4 lights burning in the cairn, and none of them threw a shadow. They saw that Gunnar was merry, and he wore a joyful face. He sang a song, and so loud that it might have been heard though they had been farther off. He that lavished rings in largesse, when the fight's red raindrops fell, bright of face with heartstrings hardy, Hogni's father met his fate. Then his brow with helmet shrouding, bearing battle shield, he spake, I will die the prop of battle, sooner die than yield an inch. Yes, sooner die than yield an inch. After that the cairn was shut up again. Would you believe these tokens, if Njal or I told them to thee? Said Scarpitting. I would believe them, he said, if Njal told them. For it is said he never lies. Such tokens as these mean much, said Scarpitting, when he shows himself to us, he who would sooner die than yield to his foes, and see how he has taught us what we ought to do. End quote. And the story is mostly oriented around events that could likely have happened. There's not very much that's supernatural, but there are a few hints of those kinds of things. As we saw, there are the visions or whatever it might be of the blood pouring out of the halberd and similar things. And there's a phrase that is used a couple times, and the phrase is something like, the trolls take thy friends, or the trolls take you. At another time, a character says, the trolls take thy boasting and bragging. At another part, a sorcerer is hired as a kind of a hitman for a character named Thangbrand. And so then the sorcerer goes and opens the earth under the guy while he's riding on his horse, and the guy is able to spring off the horse quickly, so he is fine, but the horse falls into the chasm and disappears. So the sorcerer has somehow split the earth open. And in describing the adventures that a character named Thorkel goes on, it says in passing, quote, Thence he fared east into Njal'sSaga, and there he slew a flying fire drake, end quote. That's it. There's no explanation. There's no other reference to a flying fire drake. It's the only one in the whole story. And this guy went there, slew one, and it wasn't even explained in any detail. And toward the end of the story, Christianity starts to appear. And this next passage refers to King Olaf, who was a real Norwegian king who built the first church in Norway, and he converted his subjects to Christianity. So his reign was a significant development in the conversion of the Norse peoples to Christianity. The author writes, quote, Along with that was heard that there had been a change of faith in Norway. They had cast off the old faith, but King Olaf had christened the western lands, Shetland, and the Orkneys, and the Faroe Islands. Then many men spoke so that Njal heard it, that it was a strange and wicked thing to throw off the old faith. Then Njal spoke and said, It seems to me as though this new faith must be much better, and he will be happy who follows this rather than the other. And if those men come out hither who preach this faith, then I will back them well. End quote. So Njal likes the sound of this new religion that's coming to them. And by the way, King Olaf reigned from 995 to 1000, so that puts us comfortably in the range that some people have estimated for the timeline of Njal'sSaga, which is from 960 to 1020. So now we're somewhere around the year 997. Though there is still some competition with the old religion. Two characters are talking. Quote, Hast thou heard, she said, how Thor challenged Christ to single combat, and how he did not dare to fight with Thor? I have heard tell, says Thangbrand, that Thor was naught but dust and ashes, if God had not willed that he should live. End quote. So the paganist is saying, Christ backed down from a fight with Thor, and the new Christian says Thor wouldn't even exist if God didn't will that he exist. Some interesting schoolyard theology there. And it sometimes got a little more serious than that. There's a gathering at the Thing that almost turned into a fight between Christians and pagans. Quote, "Then many Christian men rode to meet them, and they rode in battle array to the Thing. The heathen men had drawn up their men in array to meet them, and it was a near thing that the whole body of the Thing had come to blows. But still it did not go so far." End quote. That was a poor choice of translation by somebody to use the phrase, "it was a near thing," when you're also talking about the capital T thing of this assembly. That makes it a little confusing, but you get the meaning. Then later the disagreement takes on a more formal shape, and they try to settle it. Quote, "Both sides went to the Hill of Laws, and each, the Christian men as well as the heathen, took witness and declared themselves out of the other's laws. And then there was such an uproar on the Hill of Laws that no man could hear the other's voice. After that, men went away, and all thought things looked like the greatest entanglement. The Christian men chose as their speaker Hall of the Side, but Hall went to Thorgir, the priest of Lightwater, who was the old speaker of the law, and gave him 3 marks of silver to utter what the law should be. But still, that was most hazardous counsel, since he was a heathen. Thorgir lay all that day on the ground, and spread a cloak over his head, so that no man spoke with him. But the day after, men went to the Hill of Laws, and then Thorgir bade them be silent and listen, and spoke thus. It seems to me as though our matters were come to a deadlock, if we are not all to have one and the same law. For if there be a sundering of the laws, then there will be a sundering of the peace, and we shall never be able to live in the land. Now I will ask both Christian men and heathen, whether they will hold to those laws which I utter. They all said they would. He said he wished to take an oath of them, and pledges that they would hold to them, and they all said yeah to that. And so he took pledges from them. This is the beginning of our laws, he said, that all men shall be Christian here in the land, and believe in one God, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, but leave off all idol worship, not expose children to perish, and not eat horseflesh. It shall be outlawry if such things are proved openly against any man, but if these things are done by stealth, then it shall be blameless. But all this heathendom was all done away with within a few years' space, so that those things were not allowed to be done either by stealth or openly. Thorgir then uttered the law as to keeping the Lord's Day and fast days, Yuletide and Easter, and all the greatest high days and holidays. The heathen men thought they had been greatly cheated, but still the true faith was brought into the law, and so all men became Christian here in the land." End quote. So the pagans and the Christians get into a big fight on the hill. Not a physical fight, but they're yelling at each other, and it seems like it's going to go badly. And then they hire this guy Thorgir, who's a pagan, to be the speaker for the Thing. The Thing, the capital T Thing, always has a speaker, somebody who's sort of running the show. And it says the Christians paid him some silver, or rather the Christians went to one guy. They went to Hall, but then Hall went to Thorgir and paid him some silver. And this was risky because Thorgir was a pagan. And then Thorgir lies down on the ground with a cloak on his face, I guess to contemplate what he should do, what he should say. And then he goes and says, look, if we don't settle this, we're going to have a civil war. We all need to be under one law. We can't have 2 different sets of laws. Do you all agree to abide by whatever laws I say? And they all say yes. And he gets them to take a vow, to take a pledge. And they all take it. And then he basically states Christianity to be the law. That we're going to get rid of the pagan practices. We're going to believe in one God. But it is interesting that Yuletide and Easter keep going. So this is at least one explanation of the heritage of Yuletide and Easter. They maybe were originally pagan holidays, or at least there was a comparable holiday going on at the same time. And they're not going to eat horses anymore, and they're not going to leave children out in the cold. I guess they were doing that for some reason under certain circumstances. So they're getting rid of the pagan practices and bringing in the Christian ones, and there's a little bit of a mixture of the two with some of the holidays. And the pagans feel very cheated by this, but this shows the strength of that vow that they took, that they don't break it. They just now are Christians because to keep their vow, to keep their word, is more important to them even than keeping their pagan religion, apparently. And maybe also they didn't want to have a war, so that may have been part of it as well. And now these final few passages that we're going to look at lead up to the death of Njal. The first one is a kind of a prophecy, and it has the words Carline, which is a word for an old woman or a witch or a hag, and a vetch. Vetch is a plant. It's a kind of a weed. The author writes, quote, There was a Carline at Bergthorsknall, whose name was Salvuna. She was wise in many things and foresighted, but she was then very old, and Njal's sons called her an old dotard, when she talked so much, but still some things which she said came to pass. It fell one day that she took a cudgel in her hand, and went up above the house to a stack of vetches. She beat the stack of vetches with her cudgel, and wished that it might never thrive. Wretch that it was. Scarpitting laughed at her, and asked why she was so angry with the vetch stack. This stack of vetches, said the Carline, will be taken and lighted with fire when Njal my master is burnt, house and all, and Bergthora my foster child. Take it away to the water, or burn it up as quick as you can. We will not do that, says Scarpitting, for something else will be got to light a fire with, if they are foredoomed, though this stack were not here. The Carline babbled the whole summer about the vetch stack, that it should be got indoors, but something always hindered it. End quote. So this old woman foresees that this bunch of weeds is going to be used to burn down the house and Njal as well. And she says they should be moved away. And I guess Scarpitting doesn't take her seriously, or maybe he does, but he thinks that if they move those weeds away, if it's foredoomed that Njal will burn and the house will burn, then there's nothing to be done about it. And we hear it in this passage, and we've heard it in at least one or two others that we've looked at today, but it appears in other places in the text, a kind of a fatalism, that if something is destined to happen, it's going to happen and you can't avoid it, which is certainly not unique to this story, but it does come through at more than one point. Later, they're having a meal. The author writes, quote, after that, she set meat on the board, and Njal said, wondrously now it seems to me. Methinks I see all round the room, and it seems as though the gable wall were thrown down, but the whole board and the meat on it was one gore of blood. All thought this strange but Scarpitting. He bade men not be downcast, nor to utter other unseemly sounds, so that men might make a story out of them. For it befits us, surely, more than other men, to bear ourselves well, and it is only what is looked for from us. Grim and Helgi came home ere the board was cleared, and men were much struck at that. Njal asked why they had returned so quickly, but they told what they had heard. Njal bade no man go to sleep, but to beware of themselves. So Njal has this vision, and he sees a lot of gore in place of the meat that's in front of him, and the wall of the building is not there. And you'll notice one thing that's interesting about people seeing visions in this story is that they are totally sentient. They're completely of their own mind when they see them. And they say, oh, isn't that strange? I'm seeing this right now. They don't go into a trance and then recall it afterwards. But then Scarpitting says, we should carry ourselves well. We should do this more than other people. That is, we shouldn't get scared by this. And other people expect this of us. And Njal says that no one should go to sleep and everybody should be on guard. And this next passage deals with the death of Njal. The author writes, quote, a plan comes into my mind. I have seen a loft over the hall among the cross trees, and we will put the fire in there, and light it with the vetch stack that stands just above the house. Then they took the vetch stack and set fire to it, and they who were inside were not aware of it, till the whole hall was ablaze over their heads. Then Flosi and his men made a great pile before each of the doors, and then the women folk who were inside began to weep and to wail. Njal spoke to them and said, keep up your hearts, nor utter shrieks, for this is but a passing storm, and it will be long before you have another such. And put your faith in God, and believe that he is so merciful that he will not let us burn both in this world and the next. Such words of comfort had he for them all, and others still more strong. Now the whole house began to blaze. Then Njal went to the door and said, is Flosi so near that he can hear my voice? Flosi said that he could hear it. Will you, said Njal, take an atonement from my sons, or allow any men to go out? I will not, answered Flosi. Take any atonement from your sons, and now our dealings shall come to an end once and for all. And I will not stir from this spot till they are all dead, but I will allow the women and children and housecarls to go out. Then Njal went into the house and said to the folk, now all those must go out to whom leave is given. And so go out, Thorhalla, Osgrim's daughter, and all the people also with thee who may. Then Thorhalla said, this is another parting between me and Helgi than I thought of a while ago. But still I will egg on my father and brothers to avenge this man's scathe which is brought here. Go, and good go with thee, said Njal, for you are a brave woman. After that she went out, and much folk with her. Then Astrid of Deepback said to Helgi, Njal's son, you come out with me, and I will throw a woman's cloak over you, and cover your head with a kerchief. He spoke against it at first, but at last he did so at the prayer of others. So Astrid wrapped the kerchief round Helgi's head, but Thorhilda, Scarpedin's wife, threw the cloak over him, and he went out between them. And then Thorgerda, Njal's daughter, and Helga her sister, and many other folk went out too. But when Helgi came out, Flosi said, "That is a tall woman and broad across the shoulders that went yonder. Take her and hold her." But when Helgi heard that, he cast away the cloak. He had got his sword under his arm, and hewed at a man, and the blow fell on his shield and cut off the point of it, and the man's leg as well. Then Flosi came up and hewed at Helgi's neck, and took off his head at a stroke. Then Flosi went to the door and called out to Njal, and said he would speak with him and Bergthora. And Njal did so. And Flosi said, "I will offer thee, Master Njal, leave to go out, for it is unworthy that you should burn indoors." "I will not go out," said Njal, "for I am an old man, and little fitted to avenge my sons, but I will not live in shame." Then Flosi said to Bergthora, "Come out, housewife, for I will for no sake burn you indoors." "I was given away to Njal young," said Bergthora, "and I have promised him this, that we would both share the same fate." After that they both went back into the house. "What counsel shall we now take?" said Bergthora. "We will now go to our bed," says Njal, "and lay us down. I have long been eager for rest." Then she said to the boy Thord, Kari's son, "You I will take out, and you shall not burn in here." "You have promised me this, grandmother," said the boy, "that we should never part so long as I wish to be with you. But I think it is much better to die with you and Njal than to live after you." Then she bore the boy to her bed, and Njal spoke to his steward and said, "Now you shall see where we lay down, and how I lay us out, for I mean not to stir an inch hence, whether reek or burning smart me, and so you will be able to guess where to look for our bones." He said he would do so. There had been an ox slaughtered, and the hide lay there. Njal told the steward to spread the hide over them, and he did so. So there they lay down both of them in their bed, and put the boy between them. Then they signed themselves and the boy with the cross, and gave over their souls into God's hand, and that was the last word that men heard them utter. Then the great beams out of the roof began to fall, and Scarpitting said, "Now must my father be dead, and I have neither heard groan nor cough from him." End quote. There's a few things going on there. One is that while earlier in the story, when they were trying to kill Gunnar, burning the house down was rejected as a dishonorable plan for fighting him. But in this case, it was accepted. So Njal was killed in a dishonorable way. Not for him, but for the attackers. It was a cowardly way to kill somebody. And the women and children are let out. And Flosi offers to let Njal out also. But Njal knows that he's too old now to avenge his sons, and he doesn't want to live without being able to avenge them. So he decides to stay in the house, and his wife wants to stay with him, and their grandson wants to stay with them as well. So they stay in the house. And you might have heard the word manscathe, M-A-N-S-C-A-T-H-E, which people translate as manslaughter, as killing. And Scarpitting, who is outside the building, notes that he did not hear Njal cough or groan, despite being either smothered by smoke or burned alive. The implication being that he endured death calmly. I won't read those passages, but Kari, who was meant to be burned in the building, manages to escape. And when Flosi learns of this, he knows that it's bad news. And in the end, Kari comes back and avenges this killing. I'll just finish with a short line that is a sentiment that we've seen in other contexts on this podcast and also discussed, but it's interesting to see it here. The author writes, quote, "Though we here tell of some of the deeds that were done, still there are far many more of which men have handed down no stories." End quote. And that's always true, that as much history as we read and we try to study and remember great figures and events of the past, there are many more that were never recorded. And so they are lost to our collective memory, which in another way makes the available history even more important, because we can learn and remember that history, not only for its own sake, but for the sake of that history that we can never learn. And those are the passages I wanted to read you from Njal'sSaga. If you enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and pick up a copy of the edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I printed. It is of excellent print quality. I'm very happy with how it came out. I put in 97 footnotes throughout the text that explain some of the historical, literary, geographical references in the book, and some of the more top-shelf vocabulary words that Mary Shelley uses. I worked with an artist to develop an original cover that I think reflects a significant aspect of the story that is often overlooked. A lot of times with printings of Frankenstein, you'll just get a goofy image of the monster taken from some old movie on the cover, which really doesn't do any justice to the story. And most of all, I have it at a good price with free shipping. So I hope you will support independent book publishing and go over to my website, again, volrathpublishing.com. The link is in the description, and pick up a copy for yourself right now. And by the way, in this episode, if you heard any background noise, any meowing or running around or something, we recently got a kitten. We have a friend whose cat had a litter of kittens, and she was trying to give them away, so we took one of them. And that kitten has been running around in the room and climbing all over me while I'm making this. So please excuse any background noise. Farewell until next time. Take care, and happy reading.